Hello, everybody. This is Miss Jarman speaking. We had some technical difficulties this week, and I'm actually re-recording the lesson. This is not my lesson. Ms. Martinez and Ms. Brown did this lesson, but we can't get the video to work. So I'm re-recording it with my voice, and I hope it works this time. Anyway, we're going to be learning about Washington State government this week. What is government? We use the word a lot, but what do we really mean when we say the word government? Well, basically a government is just a big group of people all living together, and government has to do with how the power is organized among that group of people. Who controls the people, and how do the people control each other? How do things even work? That's kind of what we mean when we say government. And you can see this is an awesome illustration off to the side. It just talks about different kinds of governments that we have throughout the world. An aristocracy, for example, is a government in which the people with the most money control everything. A monarchy, you guys have probably heard of monarchies, that's where the king or the queen controls everything. And I won't go through every single one of them, but just, democracy, that's what we have in the United States. And the people control things by voting for the people in charge. Here are a few vocabulary words that are going to come up in this lesson. This word is consensus, and it just means that everybody agrees. It's different from voting, where you might have like 3 against 1 or 4 against 5. Consensus means that every single person agrees. This word is jurisdiction. A jurisdiction is a kind of a region, and everyone who lives in a particular jurisdiction has a particular government that has control over it. This word is supersede, and I love this word, supersede. It just means something replaces something else. It supersedes it. This word is constitution. A constitution is basically just like a whole bunch of rules and principles and ideals that a society agrees to and decides that that's how we're going to live our lives. This word is republic, and it means a government where people in power elect representatives and a president. All right, so those words will come up throughout the lesson, and let's move on. When we talk about government in the United States, we talk about something called checks and balances. This is exactly the same as that colored picture that you see above that has Donald Trump and the various buildings in Washington, D.C. on it. This is a different picture of basically the same idea, which is that in the United States, we have 3 different branches of government that have certain powers, but they also keep each other in check, and they balance each other out. No one of these branches is any more powerful than the other. So we've got Congress, the legislative branch. They write the laws. We've got the president, that's the executive branch. The president enforces the laws. And then we've got judicial, and that's the Supreme Court. And they interpret the laws and decide what they really mean. This is background information. It's good to know as we get into talking about Washington State government. You can use that colored picture above that has Donald Trump on it to for reference as we go on. All right, so within the United States, there are a couple different kinds of governments we're going to talk about now. Let's talk about, first of all, our national government. That's what we've been looking at, that those checks and balances and the president and Congress and the Supreme Court. That is our national government. That's the government of the country. Sometimes you'll hear it called the federal government, and it's the government of our whole country, United States of America. Now, the United States of America is made up of 50 independent but united states. Washington State is one of those 50 states. And each one of those 50 states has its own form of government within the federal government. This also includes territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and the difference between state government and federal government is that the state is just focused on the issues and the people who live in that particular state. From there, we have what we're going to call local governments. So remember, inside a state are many, many, many cities and towns and counties and school districts, and all of that is what we call local government. And finally, we have tribal governments. Tribal governments are really important. You remember that in the United States, way back in the 1840s, 50s or so, tribes were had to sign treaties, and they were put on these reservations. And so in every state now, including Washington, the tribes govern the native people who live on those reservations that were created when their ancestors signed those treaties with the federal government. So state and local governments are kind of modeled after the way that the national government works. They follow that same pattern of checks and balances and such. Tribal governments do that too. They're partly based on the national model, but they're also partly based on the traditional ways that tribes govern themselves since time immemorial, before white people ever set foot here. They keep those traditions alive in the way that they govern themselves now. Really, it all comes back to that land-based values and Judeo-Christian or colonist values. So let's remember, land-based values means you are part of and one with the earth and working within it. And then Judeo-Christian / colonist values sees humans kind of on top of everything and controlling everything and using it to their fullest advantage, and maybe not really thinking so much about how to sustain it and keep it going. So here's the question that Ms. Brown and Martinez have for us, and it's an interesting question. If our values influence how we govern ourselves, how do you think land-based and colonial values influence the different types of government each creates? So what this question is asking is, do you think that land-based values is going to lead to a different kind of government than Judeo-Christian values, colonial values? What do we think about that? And while we're thinking about that, let's look at this timeline. All the way since time immemorial, these tribes, these independent nations, these native nations governed themselves. And colonial government has only existed for that little bit part right there. So let's keep that in mind as we look at the different kinds of government in Washington State. Tribal government, land-based people have been governing themselves since time immemorial. Treaties did not invent tribal government. land-based values continue to drive tribal government with principles like stewardship, that means we take care of our land, relationship, we take care of each other. This word is symbiosis. It is a science word, and it means basically like my existence helps you and your existence helps me. Symbiosis, we live together. And knowledge. Tribes historically have been ruled by consensus. That's one of the vocabulary words we talked about at the very beginning of this. And consensus means that everybody basically agrees. And so we're not going to make a move forward even if only one person really doesn't like that idea. We're going to work with that person and make sure that we can, modify the idea so that they do like consensus. There's no separation of church and state with tribal government. Their religion and spirituality is part of the government too. Today, most tribes have constitutions. They have elected tribal councils and different departments such as the courts, law enforcement, natural resources, and tribal membership. All right, and here is a really cool infographic that just shows how these different governments work together within the United States and within their individual states and local government, and just sort of what each one's role is. I feel like this is going to be a lot of me talking if I read you this whole thing, so let's just take a really good look at it. Let's know that it's here for reference later. I think what I'll do is I'll put up an individual picture of just this slide so that we can look at it in more detail later on in the questions. And I'm just going to not say much more about that, but leave it there for us to look at and study. Let's talk about tribes and Seattle. Seattle is on the traditional homelands of a few Coast Salish tribes, including the Suquamish, Duwamish, and Muckleshoot tribes. Because the state requires schools to partner with the closest treaty tribes or tribes whose traditional homelands the schools exist, the Suquamish and Muckleshoot are the partner tribes of Seattle Public Schools. So we actually have two tribes that partner with our school with this curriculum and with lots of things. Well, let's talk about casinos. They're really important for tribes. So, just like states, just like the 50 United States, each state can pass any law as long as it doesn't violate the Constitution or federal law, 10th Amendment. You guys remember that, I hope. So, same is true for tribes. Tribes can pass any law as long as it doesn't violate federal law. Now, tribal casinos are a very important source of new jobs and income for tribes and for nearby communities. And the tribes also donate money from the casinos to charities and community projects that help everyone. The federal government provides money and services as part of their treaty obligations to the tribes who ceded their lands. Some tribal casinos pay for their young members to go to college. And this slide asks us, what are tribes doing to support their communities? Well, as tribal governments grow, many tribes need more employees, managers, and leaders. So tribal governments are investing more in scholarships to encourage young tribal members to go to college and to learn the skills that they will need to lead tribal governments and run tribal enterprises in the years to come. Why are tribal governments so important? Well, tribal governments have become more and more important, not just to Indians, but to all of us, because they're involved in issues such as saving wild salmon, protecting the health of rivers and streams, managing urban growth, improving education, and creating jobs. So those land-based values that tribal folks have just had since time immemorial, that benefits all of us, and not just Indian people. Tribes are also opening new museums and working to preserve their history and renew their cultural traditions. This is a list of federally recognized tribes in Washington state. And rather than read these all to you, I'm going to have a copy of just this slide below for you to look at and reference. And you can look at it and reference it now. There's a little map to go with it. How many of those tribes did you know about before? Do you recognize any of those names? There are also a few tribes that are not federally recognized, which means that the federal government does not recognize them as tribes unto themselves. And here are a few of those. So among the people, we call them delegates. Way back in the day when Washington was becoming a state, these delegates got together and wrote our Constitution. 22 of them were lawyers, 19 of them were farmers or ranchers, 9 of them owned stores or worked in banks, 6 of them were doctors, 3 of them were teachers, and 3 of them were miners. They worked in mines. None of them were women. They were all men. Women did not get the right to vote in Washington state until 1910, and then it was another 10 years before they had the right to vote federally. So there were no women delegates who started our Washington state government. There were also no natives. The structure of Washington state's government is just like the structure of the federal government with those 3 branches. So that slide we looked at earlier, that picture up above, our Washington state government has the same 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, same as the federal government. Let's talk about the legislative branch, the Senate and House of Representatives. and the people. Being a state senator or representative is a part-time job. So even though they're in charge of writing our laws, it's only a part-time job. The reason why is because the legislature usually only meets 2 or 3 months of the year. Most of our state legislators have regular jobs, or they run their own farms or businesses, and then they just take time off to go to Olympia, our state capital, for 2 or 3 months when the legislature is in session. The people who wrote our state constitution wanted it this way because they thought people who worked at regular jobs would make better laws, laws that really served the needs of ordinary people like themselves. They didn't want to create a separate profession of politicians. They wanted the legislature to really be of the people, by the people, for the people. So another kind of unique thing about Washington State is that the people have the power to bypass the legislature through what we call the initiative and referendum powers of citizens. So in the early 20th century, people wanted to make sure that citizens kept control over the government. So even though our state government has the same checks and balances as our national government, Washington voters changed it. So an initiative just means that if you can get enough signatures to propose a law, it can go on the ballot and everybody in the state can vote for it. A referendum is if citizens get enough signatures to vote on whether to keep or get rid of an existing law, that can go on the ballot too. So this gives a lot of power to the people who live in Washington State. If you can get out there and get enough people to sign on to your idea, that can go on the ballot and the people of Washington State can vote on it and maybe make it a new law or maybe take away an old law. It's kind of a cool thing. It doesn't always work as well as it's supposed to, but you know, it's kind of a cool thing. One of the most important amendments to the Constitution was passed in 1912 when the initiative and referendum were added to that section of the legislative branch in government. How a bill becomes a law. Oh, who remembers this from Schoolhouse Rock? Oh, you know what? I'm just going to put the Schoolhouse Rock video in there. That Schoolhouse Rock video is about how a federal bill becomes a federal law, but very, very similar process for how a state bill becomes a state law. So there that is. More on that. I'll put that video in there.
All right, so for the entire state of
So that's the legislative branch. Let's talk about the executive branch. Washington's executive branch is different from many other states. In most states, the governor is one of 3 or 4 elected state officials. So in most states, the governor has a lot of power. Now in Washington, well, our governor has a fair amount of power, but they are one of 9 statewide elected officials. Washington's governor may have less power than governors in other states, but our governor still has a lot to do. And here's the list of those 9 elected officials, in addition to the governor. Judicial branch. Here's a fun fact. In 2004, Washington State was the first state in the nation to have 5 women sitting as judges on its Supreme Court. All right. all the judges in Washington state are elected. That it's not how it is in a lot of places, but that's how it is here. And there are 4 different levels of courts. There are the local city courts, and they handle small things like traffic tickets and small crimes. Superior courts handle what are called civil cases like divorce, child custody, juvie, family matters, and then more serious crimes, which are called felonies. There's the appeals court. There's one in Tacoma, and Seattle, and Spokane. So an appeal is when, like, if you go to Superior Court and you don't agree with what the judge decided, you can appeal. You can say, nope, I want a do-over. So that's what the appeals court is. And then there's the State Supreme Court in Olympia with 9 justices they're called. And they hear appeals from the lower courts and decide if they want to take up the case or not. That's the most important one, the Supreme Court. But they're all important in different ways on different matters.
And all right, so last but not least, local government. In Washington state, we have 39 counties. Counties, not countries, counties. These counties were created during the time that Washington state was a territory back in the mid to late 1800s because people needed services locally that were not being met. That is because the territorial government was far away in Oregon. So they created these counties, and the services that the county governments provide for everyone include collecting property taxes, protecting public health, providing human Alright, so city mayor. In big cities, being a mayor means you have a full-time job. The mayor's role is similar to that of the governors, where they kind of oversee the departments of the city. And the mayor can propose new laws, like an annual budget, but if the council has ideas or they don't like it, they can make changes to the ideas of the mayor. So the mayor doesn't have the final say, they have to work closely together with the council. Alright, so small town mayors. Mayors in small towns are different than city mayors, as in it's not a full-time job. They just kind of go in and lead meetings, maybe represent the town in special events, and when they meet together, the branches of government within small towns kind of have to come together and function together, like the legislative branch and the executive branch, because there's not enough people to have separate branches. All right, so now that you know how the government works, what can you do as a citizen? What can you do in your community? When you get old enough, vote. Share your voice, share your opinion, vote. Because it does matter, it does count. Right now that you are young, be open to new ideas, be open to new people and perspectives, be eager to learn. And I'm not just talking about school and learning, World War II. I mean, learn about different people. Get out of your comfort zone and learn. Knowledge is power. And just build a stronger community. There's community within school. Get involved in clubs, after school activities. Question everything. That's how you learn, by asking questions. Asking questions is a big way of learning, but it's also a way to speak up. So if you do not agree with something, speak up, say it. Right now, with this movement going on, I have seen a lot of young people organizing rallies and protests to voice their beliefs, and that is a big way to show and get involved in your community. Speaking up, being an advocate.